This time I would like to say a few words about the work of the Pope John Paul II, which is, this is a Polish edition, but in English that was translated from the original Italian as Crossing the Threshold of Hope. It was edited in 1994, based on an interview given by the Pope in 1993. And I am not intending to criticize John Paul II or praise him either. I just want to clarify in more secular terms what it's all about and what is the vision of the Catholic Church, which we can observe in the thoughts and articles and works of John Paul II in his view of the Church and its role in the modern world. Well, funny thing is that this journalist that was making this interview with the Pope was very cautious not to discredit the Pope. Then was very concerned about the whole thing. The interview with the Pope, it was something new back then, and he was thinking maybe it's something that well, it's not dignifying the Pope, just the opposite. But he made the interview anyway, and his questions were by no means inquisitive. He is rather giving the floor to the Pope, and the Pope is switching the topics very often. Not always, but very often. The first is about not being afraid. Not being afraid of being who we are, and so on. It was a big thing in the Pope's program, and I think it's a good thing that people accept themselves as they are, and so no problems here. I can only state that I think that it's maybe a little bit some sort of adapting for the church purposes of the movement of self-esteem, which is making the church looking a little bit secondary ideologically. Then it's saying that because the Pope is convinced that the man is so-called, that would be a priest of the creation, and also that many things that people are doing are really getting closer to the Opus Gloriae and to the work of God. But the problem is that the science and technology are closing to this Opus Gloriae, but because they are only a creation of man, they can also take people away from God and from religion. This is the typical concern of all priests. Since they are not, it's very typical. Now he's talking about two visions of God. The one is the cold God, the very rational and a little bit distanced from the people's from the humankind. The God of philosophers, and there's this God which is an actor in the world, the typical Christian God, the person, so this personified God. And the Pope is, what is interesting, a little bit blaming the Christian philosophers, like for instance Thomas Aquinas, for making this more hard to distinguish. When they were talking about the absolute, there's some sort of unanimated, or maybe not animated, but not human-like figure of God, like the pure power. And when they were talking about this pure power, and when they were talking about the Christian God, which is like a more human, or the other way around, to be precise. human are more like God. This is about the Pope is expressing some concerns about the imbalance, the ill balance of man in the modern world. That in human within the humans, so many elements that are competing, that are getting to this ill balance. Maybe a religion is the only thing that could help out. That people don't know what they want and so on. The other thing is the problem is the empirical evidence, which is which the science is oriented on to, and this is a problem according to Pope, because the modern phenomenology, for instance, can explain that we are not experiencing other people only by their, I don't know, size, or by their behavior, or how they look like and so on, or even by their actions, but we experience people as a whole. And Paul Ricoeur and Emmanuel Levinas are closer to the vision of man that the Church nowadays also holds. Which is very funny that to this very unclear type of methodology the Church is trying to build bridge to. The other problem is that the Pope seems not to know, or pretend not to know, what really agnosticism and atheism is. He is saying that the people who are asking the questions like what are the proof of God's existence, why the God seems to be hiding from humankind, why God is not making more self-evident that He exists, it would be easier, and so on. The Pope is of an opinion that these are typical agnostic questions. And agnosticism is by no means atheism, and it's especially not the kind of atheism that Marxist atheism was, or atheism typical for the Enlightenment period was. So he's basically saying that atheism is something that is planned, that you are planning to reject God. And which is absurd, because there's no such thing as state atheism, there's no such thing as planned atheism, projected atheism. It's an absurd. What the Russians, the Bolsheviks did was just made people by force to pretend that they were less religious than they really were. So it's not, and this is no way of no way of imposing atheism, really, because you cannot really change the way people think. You can make them want to pretend that they have slightly or just or totally different opinion that they really hold, but that's all. So when the priests, for instance, today are talking about the return to faith in Russia, for instance, there was no return to faith. Just after the fall of the Soviet Union, the religion and the faith is okay again, so they don't have to hide with the religious feelings. And it's very funny that atheism is something that is planned, that it's something politically orientated, according to the Pope, and it's just the other way around. The real atheism is the atheism that is only responding to our psychological structure. For instance, when I was discussing with my Lutheran friend the problem of existing of God in cosmos, we are not trying to convince each other. We are just merely stating that for him the existence of a caring father-like figure, God as a caring father-like figure somewhere in the cosmos, in the space, is just more convincing to his way of of seeing things and giving it making more sense. And for me, the neutral cosmos is more convincing. I just adding God into this puzzle makes it for me less convincing, less assuring, and less reassuring. And maybe it's just that being religious or not just only depends of our psychological structure, nothing more. So we cannot really convince each other so much. We can change gradually, very gradually, sometimes the view of how we think, or maybe our way of thinking psychologically, our fears and our what reassures us, what makes us worried and so on. So the atheism only can be achieved, I think, by normal thinking, by normal experiencing the world and seeing no point of being religious. And these kind of questions he mentioned as typical for agnostics, like why God is not making his presence self-evident more often, like not making miracles every day or something like that. It's not only typically agnostic questions and by no means atheistic question. It can also be a very typical atheistic question, but not on the ground of explaining the world and how it functions, but on the ground of morality, that maybe religious is immoral because it didn't think about those things, and that's all. So it's also typically, this set of questions is also typically atheist, but only on moral grounds, not on explaining the world ground. He's saying that if the God is more personified, is more person than the pure force, then there is a small temptation that people would be explaining, making reductions from what gods to what humans, like Ludwig Feuerbach was doing. And Ludwig Feuerbach was doing precisely something a little bit different. He was explaining how people have created God, because they were convincing themselves that they are so sinful. It was a self-propelling mechanism. They were convincing themselves that they are so flawed that they and in the same time all the good things that people could boast about themselves, like intelligence or creativity or something like this was all given gradually to God. So people just stayed on just with flaws, no positive things, and that's why, and that this is what the mechanism that was enabling religion to hold on and to strengthen. And this is very, of course Pope John Paul II is not elaborating on this subject, which is a shame. It's just merely trying to convince us that Ludwig Feuerbach was trying to make the personified God even more human by making him human, by making him a human invention. And Ludwig Feuerbach was not doing that. He was not making any reductions. He was just saying that the God is a human creation. The same was, for instance, in the other philosophers' thought, Paul d'Holbach, which is not mentioned by the Pope, who was also an atheist, and he was living in the Enlightenment period. By the way, in the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, the atheist was just a margin of philosophers, which were mostly either deistic, like Voltaire or Locke, or they were or Hume, or they were just openly Christian, but more on this. We would say today ecumenical, of this more ecumenic type, like Lessing, for instance, like the German Enlightenment. So it's not, but okay, there were a couple of clearly atheistic philosophers, and of two types. For instance, Diderot was so mystical that he was less atheistic than the deist Frederick the Great was. Frederick the Great was more atheistic than Diderot was, although in name, Diderot was perceiving himself as atheist, but this is very typical. For instance, when you get rid of religion and you try to convince yourself to Marxism, for instance, then Marxism is not getting this, not taking this religiosity away. It's just making taking the same place in which your natural religiosity was. So you cannot really make some people atheists. You can just take one religion from them and give them the other religion, and this was precisely what the Bolsheviks were doing, and the Marxists. So they were not appealing to this rational element, but to this irrational religious element. Okay, getting back to Olbach said that God is also man's creation, so he was basically saying what Ludwig Feuerbach was saying a little bit later, but he was of an opinion that the God is an image of a very good feudal master, a very good and just aristocrat. Everyone would wish to be ruled by. There was an interesting question. Once at least, this journalist was trying to do a good job. So he asked the Pope why Christ cannot be just like some other religion founder like Buddha or Muhammad or Socrates, so just a wise man, not a God figure. Of course, the Pope was stating that yes, Christendom is specific and in the positive way. We can argue very, very different from other religions. In a positive way, the Pope says, we can only say that yes, it's really a difference here, but I'm not sure if it's good or bad. Okay, the God should be perceived, the Pope says, as a figure that exists in the world, as is preoccupied with what is happening to people, not some philosophical power that is occupied with itself. That the world, later he states that the world is not capable of making people free from suffering. Of course, religious only is, I guess, I gather. The Pope would like to say. He said that God was crucified on the cross, not to prove something to mankind, but only to show that the God is caring about humankind, and this suffering is not it's not of no meaning for God, the human suffering. So and the same we should think about the great the suffering of man, like the Holocausts in plural, for instance, of the black slaves from Africa. It's funny that the Pope is also holding many post-colonial and lefty socialist political superstitions. He's not stating this openly, but he's blaming the West for the black slavery, although the black slaves were usually captured by the black African neighbors and sold first and foremost to Arabs, and then sometimes the Arabs were selling them passing them on to Westerners. Then we have interesting fragment about Buddha. Buddha is also a religion of salvation, but the problem is that Buddha was perceiving the world as something sinful and wrong, and we have to cut ourselves from the world, and this is the solution. Whereas in Christianity you have good and bad elements in the world, and that's why the this religion is more constructive, and I agree. He's also the Pope is more. I agree. I think the whole development of China and Japan was mostly not based on Buddhism, but mostly on more practical belief systems like Taoism, like Confucianism, like Shinto. China and Japan, of course. The Pope is preoccupied by the problem that the religious systems and practices of the Far East are usually accepted without any criticism, and we can only assume if he's more preoccupied with the competition and also on financial grounds, or he's more preoccupied with this on this real civilization grounds. Okay, he was stating about Islam. He says that Islam is offering really no salvation. The Muslims are. He praises Muslims for being very religious. By religious he means that they are very devout. They are praying so much and so regularly, and he also appreciates the invitation by the King Hassan II to Morocco, and he said that it was also a very spiritual experience, not only political experience, the meeting the youth of Morocco in Casablanca in 1985. And he says that the problem with Islam is that it's not offering salvation. It's only the God is only to be praised, but never to be the figure that cooperates with people on salvation. God is just great, and that's that. So it's not really any promise in this religion. And the freedom of religion is, I think this is very well observed, by the way. And the freedom of religion in Islamic world is very often perceived as the permission to subjugate other people of other religions under Islamic theocratic rule. And he is also stating that the situation of the Christians in many Islamic countries is very dramatic indeed, and he's absolutely right here too. About Jews, he's just stating the fact, which is also the fact, that Christianity is just more universal because it's not nationalistic, and also that right here. So Christianity, it is special, but for instance, why not being a Lutheran, right? But okay. He's very consistently avoiding quoting any good Lutheran authors, even those who were very thoroughly and very talentedly trying and succeeding in defending the Christian orthodoxy, like Leibniz, for instance. He's not once mentioned in the book. In this interview and the book. When he was asked about the year 2000, in which it was supposed that the number of Muslims would be for the first time bigger and greater than the number of Catholics, and in the same time the number of Hindus would be greater, and maybe it's already greater than the number of Protestants and the Orthodox Slavic Christianity put together. He's saying that we should be more concerned about quality than quantity, and he was saying about he was mentioning Christ, who was giving his lectures and teachings to the 12 fishermen from Galilee. But in the same time, he was just a couple of pages later. We should say the waves of evangelicalism, evangelicalization, I don't know, preaching the scripture. The waves, one wave is the Cyril and Methody, and you know, the Christianization, I think it is in English, of the Balkans and of the Slavic world. Then the next is the 15th century, Spain and Portugal. He's not mentioning some abuses which were also here, and he's saying that this new evangelicization, I think it would be, it's not something like proselytism, and should be seen and criticized as proselytic, but which is, I think it's just handling words and it's semantics. It's not a very sincere way of thinking and way of stating things. Every Christian should be a little bit proselytic, because this is the obligation. The Jew is not, the Judaist is not supposed to be proselytic, because this is the Judaism is a religion only for one nation. But every Christian should be a little bit proselytic. So saying that evangelicalization is good and proselytism is bad is like saying of the people of secular French governments, for instance, that laïcité is good but laicism is bad. It's just manipulating with words, nothing more. And then we also discovered that quality is indeed at least as important as quantity is at least as important as quality after all, because he is rejoicing, the Pope, I mean, is rejoicing by the Santiago de Compostela gathering of young Christians in 1989, and the same about Denver 1993. So the numbers, well, matter after all. The problem is with the communism. I have a as a liberal, I have a problem here with the Pope teachings and his way of thinking, because he's saying many very troubling things indeed when it comes to communism. He is saying first that the first very problematic claim that I have problems with is that the communism is the result of modern science and modern political thinking. I think wrong. I think this vision is wrong. I think that, and it's in this view I would be supported by many Christian and conservative thinkers, like the Austrian Christian conservative thinker Erich von Kühnert-Ledin, who has said that communism was the best adopted and quickest adopted in the places when there were many monasteries. And people were used to communism to some degree, like the monasteries. Those regions was the southern Spain, Italy, southern Italy, Naples mostly, Russia also, many monasteries and much communism. So it's not just the effect of but in the same time, the Pope is maybe not in favor, but he's accepting and understanding communism to some extent. He's saying about exploiting the people who are working and so on and so on. And he's also saying he's also proliferating this lefty cliche that there is a huge gap which is bigger and getting bigger and bigger between the richer and richer and richer north and poorer and poorer and poorer south. It's true that the gap is getting bigger, but it's only because they are both south and north are getting richer and richer. So not poorer, nobody is getting poorer. But the speed of getting richer is different. The north is getting richer. The north, I mean Europe, USA, Japan, Russia, are getting richer fast, and the south is getting richer thanks to the inventions like the golden rice, for instance. They're getting richer slower, but they are getting richer. The only regions in the world when we can see hunger, for instance, is Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia, maybe because of the civil war there. So just this small fragment of earth And it used to be many more regions where hunger was the everyday's problem. Like in the 70s and 80s, the agriculture in India was totally inefficient, and even Soviet Union was forced, maybe not forced, but was giving some free food to the Indians so they could survive. You are in a very bad position indeed when you have to be helped from a bad situation by Soviet Union. But okay, so it was a problem, a global problem. Now the hunger is not a global problem. Also, it's some shortage of water and so on, but it's getting a little bit better, not worse. So saying that in the year 1993 that it's getting worse, well, it's more ideologically motivated. And he understands communism to some degree, which shocks me. He understands that it was a reaction on the exploitation. But the only problem was that the medicament was worse than the illness. Okay, and now about Vaticanum Secundum. He is also, of course, defending all the way the work and the success of the Vaticanum Secundum, and it was not called upon not called for dealing with some heresy, but was called for dealing with the problems of fragmentation of Christendom in general. So they wanted to be more ecumenic. So he said that it was Vaticanum Secundum. It was from different in style from previous gatherings of that sort, but it was not different in reality. It was not different only when it comes to style. It was different ideologically, because ecumenism and purism, which was the drive behind the previous gatherings, is just another ideology. And the problem that they were not that many people as in the past were interested in getting in becoming priests and nuns. It was the main problem that was that caused that caused the need of organizing Vaticanum Secundum, says the Pope. And it's getting slightly better after Vaticanum Secundum, just slightly, he says, and he admits that, with the will of becoming nuns and priests. But he's just totally forgetting the huge problem which was observed by Benedict XVI, who was preparing some of the documents for Vaticanum Secundum, but then he has observed that this new reform has discouraged many Catholics which were thinking that Catholicism is not perceived as, even by the Catholic hierarchy, as something very special. So they were just tending to, and they tend today, to more traditionalist forms of Catholicism, like the Tridentine masses and so on. So there's a new gap forming in the place of another, and it's very curious why John Paul II, although he had more than 2 decades to observe this tendency, he just failed to do so. From the whole book, it seems that John Paul II is really it's very visible that he was an actor. He was very good with words, but not so very good with when it comes to some sort of discipline of thinking. He's just manipulating with words. I'm not sure. Usually I think this manipulating is just based on his wishful thinking, not on the will of manipulating, but it is produced. Many of his thoughts and sentences are produced in such a way as we can observe very much of intellectual insincerity So there is this problem. My case here was not to blaming the Pope. I'm not blaming him for, well, of course there are things like being against condoms in Africa, which was when he had this opportunity to stop proliferation of AIDS in Africa, but he didn't use this opportunity. Maybe he had some reasons, I don't know. But well, so the Pope could be criticized for many things. I was just merely trying to observe the way in which he was thinking, and to present his thoughts in a little bit more secular way, to make them more understandable for the people who are outside the Catholic Church, as I am. Well, at least I think about myself as being outside of.